All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. It's an educational channel. Try to check out great theories and discoveries that you probably have never heard of, but if you did, they would make a big impact on your life. Today is our 273rd Bible Decode. All of them are focusing on the New Testament at this point. We're going to get into the Old Testament later, but we've been kicking around not only the Dead Sea Scrolls, but also the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament, that the Romans are the true authors of the New Testament as a psychological operation, not only against the Jews, but really in order to shore up their support from the soldiers and slaves within the Roman Empire. And this was done by the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, that is Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, from 69 till 96 AD. They wrote the story of Jesus, and they backdated the story by 40 plus years and fit him into what they call, I think it says, in the 15th year of Tiberius. That's when Jesus kind of made his debut as an adult, after passing over his entire life with very, very few details. Really only one discussion when he was 12 years old and he abandoned his family in Jerusalem, basically running away, and had no concern about whether his family was looking for him or not. Yeah, so they backdated the story by 40 years, and this was done in order to attempt to mellow out the Jews. The Flavians in particular, but Rome in general, had just gotten done fighting this long war against the Jews from 66 until 73 AD. And this was just the culmination of many other smaller wars and uprisings and revolutions and insurrections and terrorist attacks that the Jews had put on the Romans, going back all the way to 63 BC. So over 100 years of this, and Vespasian and Titus were generals in this war. They were both wounded in the war. And also, Emperor Vespasian, or General Vespasian, got the call to become the new emperor in 69 AD, at the end of what is called the Year of the Four Emperors. This was at the end of the Roman Civil War. And so what Vespasian was stepping into was that, Emperor Nero was assassinated. He was replaced by Emperor Galba, who was assassinated, who was replaced by Emperor Otho, who was assassinated, and who was replaced by Emperor Vitellius, who was assassinated, all within 1 year, or just plus 1 year, before Vespasian got the call. So naturally, you would think that he would be a bit insecure about his rule, and maybe would take some steps in order to, to safeguard himself. And I think the writing the Gospels was one of those things. They took advantage of the fact that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah. But the Messiah that the Jews were waiting for, from Old Testament prophecies and such, was a military commander who was going to rise up and overthrow the Romans. So instead, Vespasian and Titus wrote about a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace, believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, paying your taxes, and carrying the Roman soldiers' heavy pack an extra mile, and turning the other cheek to oppression. And he also advised the Roman soldiers to accept low pay, and skirted around justifying slavery, and called the Roman centurion slave owner the greatest faith in all of Israel, and then reserved his wrath, Jesus, for the Jews, overturning the tables of the Jewish money changers outside of the temple, outside of the inner core of the temple, and excoriating the Jewish merchants who were selling small animals for the temple sacrifices. These are part of the Jewish traditions and rituals that made them, kind of high maintenance for the Romans, that made them the chosen people and people that were willing to die for their traditions and rituals. Jesus also encouraged his disciples to abandon their families, really insisted that his disciples abandon their families. And as I mentioned, he abandoned his own family when he was 12 years old in Jerusalem for the Passover. So Jesus is taking direct aim at the Jewish traditions and rituals at the same time he's being deferential to the Romans. And then as we move on in the New Testament to the Pauline epistles, Paul is even more pro-Roman and more anti-Jew than Jesus even was. So this kind of should be causing you to raise a red flag and wonder, why is this happening? And is this realistic? And who wrote this? I smell a rat here. Because this is not like behavior that is realistic for a Jew to be so deferential to the Romans and against the Jews. So now the direct evidence is even more overwhelming in that what you need to break down the Gospels and really decode them is you need to read the 7-volume work of Josephus that is called War of the Jews. Now, Josephus is known among Christians because he was the first and almost only author who corroborated the existence of Jesus, which he does in his Jewish Antiquities that came out in the 90s. But about 20 years before that, he wrote War of the Jews, which is a history of this war between the Romans and the Jews, where Titus and Vespasian were basically the protagonists. And if you read War of the Jews alongside the Gospels, you will discover that they are written by the same authors, authors. Now, the stated author of War of the Jews is Josephus. I would suggest that given Josephus's autobiography and his life story, that can't really be taken seriously as being the truth, and that maybe Josephus was a pen name for a larger operation, a number of different authors, all living at the court of the Romans. Regardless, Josephus, in his autobiography, he calls himself Flavius Josephus, a Flavian, a member of the Roman Caesars of that time. And he was writing from Caesar's palace, where he lived the rest of his life, as well as court historians and with the great endorsement of Titus for his book. So we know that Josephus was coming from Rome. He was an emanation of, the approval, had the approval of the Romans. But when you read the Gospels next door, side by side, then you recognize that because of all of the parallels and parables and parodies between the two, that they were written by the same source. And the parallels move both ways. It's not just a one-way thing. For example, you can see, and Joseph Atwill has identified this, that the Gospels parody the War of the Jews in terms of Jesus. Jesus's ministry in Judea is just a parody or a replica of Titus's military campaign in Judea. Every place, according to War of the Jews, the official history of the war, every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes, in the same order, or almost completely the same order. And every place that they go, they encounter parallel events, or conceptually parallel events, sometimes with great detail. And each one of the events is 40 years apart in time. Like Jesus performs the event 40 years before Titus performs the event, because they backdated the story of Jesus. And so Jesus' story is just a parody of Titus's story. And we're talking about like 40 plus events, not just a couple of them. And then going back in the other direction to show that these are mutually parodying each other, and therefore written by the same people at the same time for the same reason. Josephus's life story, the author, Josephus's life story is nothing but a parody of Jesus's life story. Josephus talks about his lineage, how he's, got this royal blood, and that how he was trapped underground, and he was buried for 3 days, and then he rose on the third day. And about 30 other direct parallels to Jesus's life is written in War of the Jews about Josephus's life. Also, Michael Menescott dug into the book of Luke in his new book called Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. And he identified over 250 parallels between War of the Jews and just the book of Luke. Just one book in the New Testament has 250 parallels. And some of them are incredibly detailed and intricate and well hidden. And all of them as a whole, the sense that you get is that you get not a sense of coincidence. You get a sense of intentionality. Like, these people were doing this for a reason, and there was a plan, and they had a code, and there are riddles, and the basic tenor of the intention is hatred. The Romans hated the Jews, and they reflected it in these parallels. The parallels are mocking, ridiculing, biting, brutal, grim humor, and just a general disdain for the Jews and their belief systems. They really refer to the Jews as, like, for example, in Luke 4, I think it's verse 23, Jesus, it says, physician, heal thyself. Well, the parallels in War of the Jews to physician, heal thyself is Jews killing each other, Jews committing suicide and killing each other. For the Romans, that is the idea of healing, healing for Jews. The Jews were so rotten that they the only way to heal them is by killing them. Another parallel is when Jesus is speaking to Simon and Andrew on the fishing boat and trying to get them to follow him, and he says, "I will make you fishers of men." And then that's on Lake Sea of Galilee, and really Lake Galilee, and at the same location, Titus has a military battle with the Jews, and he, I think one of the Jewish ships capsizes or tips over, and all the Jews are in the water, and Titus orders his men to basically harpoon them, and when their heads stick out of the water, stab them and kill them, and he's got his men with their nets. And so Titus is literally telling his soldiers to be fishers of men. That is the kind of humor that the Romans use against the Jews. When it goes on and on. So to think that this would be a coincidence is way beyond. But then when Menescot takes his 250 parallels, he graphs them on a chart, putting the book of Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. He plots a point for every location that has a parallel. After plotting all the points, you can see that he has formed 5 almost perfect letters in Latin. APTVS, Titus Vespasian. And Latin obviously is one of the 2 main languages that the Romans used, not the Jews, along with Greek, which is the language of the Gospels and of Josephus. And so it's very difficult for anybody to tell me or for me to listen to somebody telling me that the Gospels were written by a bunch of illiterate Aramaic-speaking fishermen in Judea, when there is no evidence for that. The only evidence for the existence of Jesus, all of it is Roman. All of it is Roman Caesars and their courts, such as Josephus and Tacitus and Suetonius and Trajan, Emperor Trajan, and Pliny the Younger. These are the only people who've ever corroborated the existence of Jesus. And they're doing it because they are in on it. It's a psychological operation. It is, which is exactly right down the alley of the Romans' MO. Also, the Romans had full control of censorship, distribution, and publishing within the empire. And so there is nothing coming out if it's not something that Caesar approves of. And so we're looking at, we're continuing to read from Robert Eisenman's book here, The Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians, and this is a compendium of several of his works, including a shorter book that we're looking at called Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran. And so Eisenman is not privy at this time to the Roman origins hypothesis, but he definitely smells a rat. He's like, what is up with this guy Paul? Like, being so pro-Roman and so anti-Jew. And but really Eisenman looks a lot at the Dead Sea Scrolls, which he was one of the scholars who was most credited who the most credit should go to for exposing the Dead Sea Scrolls, because the Dead Sea Scrolls were being sequestered by these Dominican priests for over 40 years. They wouldn't translate them and disseminate them to the public because they had some embarrassing information in them for the Catholic priests. And Eisenman basically forced them out into the public in the late 80s, early 1990s. But still, very few people know what the Dead Sea Scrolls are or what their importance is. And they were discovered in the late 40s and 1950s in a series of caves near Qumran, Qumran, in near Jerusalem. Most of them are Hebraic texts that are Old Testament books like Genesis and Exodus, and many copies of Isaiah, copies of every Old Testament book except for Esther, and but there is a ton of, and that stuff is not so important to scholars because even though these are the oldest Old Testament texts that exist by centuries, the important stuff is really the sectarian material, which describes the day-to-day life and philosophies of the monks that were living there at this fortress at Qumran, what their life was, what they believed in, and it has a story basically with a righteous teacher of righteousness, and then also a wicked priest and a liar. The liar is like an insider. The wicked priest is like an outsider. And many scholars have attempted to connect this with the Jesus story, with the story of the Gospels. The Catholic priests, on their part, were trying to push it away from that, dating the text way back in the 2nd century BC. But I think the evidence is much better for these texts to have been from the 1st century AD. And then that causes the Dead Sea Scrolls to really fill a vacuum, especially once the Roman origin hypothesis really exposes the Gospels as being fiction and Josephus as being fiction. And so those are really our two best sources for understanding the 1st century. And so if you take those out, there's like nothing there. We have a very little understanding, especially of like the chronology of events in the 1st century. And so the Dead Sea Scrolls do fill a hole there. And so this, I think we're in chapter 3 here, and he's talking about Zadok. So the Zadoks are the priestly class going back to Solomon and David, and their descendants who are all, the high priests. And he's using a lot of the language that the Dead Sea Scrolls are using, and he's really trying to equate a lot of different traditions and scripts, not just the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Gospels, but also even the Talmud, and which was being started at the same time, and which was also a Flavian psychological operation. And then some of the Apocrypha, and he believes really that the teacher of righteousness was James, the brother of Jesus. Okay, well, let's knock off a few pages here. If we are unable to prove the legitimate Zadokite descent of any priestly hero of the Bible after the Solomonic period, imagine the embarrassment of the priests of Judas's day. Now that's Judas Maccabeus, the son of Mattathias Maccabeus, who was one of the Maccabees, the dynasty of Jews who kind of liberated Judea in the second century BC, lasting until the first century BC, who certainly could not do so either. Of the 24 courses of the temple, only 16 could even be Zadokite, and which ones these might be is impossible to determine. Though chronicles attempt a retrospective portrait of these, the names it includes are identifiably Second Temple. One of these is accused in Ezra's time of not even being of priestly descent. In any event, the Maccabees put forth in the safest manner possible their Zadokite claim in 1st Maccabees, an apocryphal work, by signaling their membership in the first and largest priestly courts, that of Jehoiarib. It is as good a claim as any, especially when reinforced by the portrait of Mattathias' Phineas-like behavior. Where did the assumption come from that the Maccabees could not be considered Zadokite, or even that they were not priestly, appertaining rather to some lower Levitical order? This is nothing but a confused distortion of historical data to suit desired theoretical claims. We do not even know to what course Simeon's family belonged, and it is not at all outside the realm of possibility that the Maccabees constituted a lesser branch of his family, as the Tobiads had in a previous generation. To claim Zadokite descent in Jesus' time, not to mention Davidic time, would be like being able to claim descent from Dante in our own. Ecclesiasticus, especially chapter 51, this is another apocryphal book, was so important because it delineated an instrumentality for claiming priestly legitimacy in the days when all priestly genealogies had difficulty in going back to Ezra's time. First, Simeon is the high priest, but he is so on Zadokite lines. Therefore, he is a Zadok, a pious man. Hasid and Zadok are in some sense parallel usages, probably going back to Isaiah, and have continued as such in scroll literature, Dead Sea Scroll literature, Karaism, and Jewish mysticism up to the present day. In this manner, the crucial list of Ansher Hesed in the Hebrew Ecclesiasticus begins and ends with the Zadokites, Noah and Simeon. I think we must grant that Simeon the Just is Aaronite, Aaron as in the brother of Moses, according to the normal usage of that term. In Second Temple period times, the priests, or sons of Aaron, seem more of a caste, as they were in Zoroastrianism, or as the Brahmins in India, than a specific genealogy. But is he a Zadokite to whom in Ezekiel's language, quote, the charge of God's sanctuary must go until the end of time? He is, says Ecclesiasticus, on the basis of his perfect piety, Hesed, and righteousness, Zedek. In this we have the stirrings of both the Hasidian and Zadokite movements, which are related. The Hebrew version of Ecclesiasticus adds that as such, he also accedes to the covenant of Phineas. This covenant is a bridge over any supposed genealogical deficiencies, in that being based on zeal for the law, it is qualitative, extending to all descendants of Aaron through Eleazar. It is also, to a certain extent, Zadokite in a genealogical sense, since theoretically it should not extend to the descendants of Ithamar. It is not clear, however, if it ever should be construed in this sense, though originally this might have been part of its thrust. It is also Zadokite in the esoteric sense, explaining just how a son of Zadok, or a Zadok, distinguished himself through zeal for the law. Ecclesiasticus is patently a priestly book, as the amount of space spent praising Aaron and Phinehas, to say nothing of Simeon, more than for Jacob, Moses, David, and others put together, attests. That it should have been prized at Qumran among the Zadokites, at Masada among the Sicarii. The terminology is Josephus's. And in a probable Karaite synagogue in Old Cairo is not surprising. What is often overlooked by those considering Josephus's data is the link of what he ultimately chooses to label as the zealot movement to the priestly class, despite the fact of his own affiliations as a young priest with this movement. Now, obviously, Eisenman doesn't realize that Josephus is a fraud and is fiction and maybe not didn't even exist. The Talmud, in its own manner, alludes to the priestly connections of the orientation. Though Josephus describes it to his Roman readers in the primarily political terms they could understand, the zealot movement is first of all a movement making certain claims about priestly legitimacy, and not the primarily revolutionary one Josephus and the New Testament have caused us to think of it as. Chief among these claims is the requirement for zeal for the law as a prerequisite for service at the temple altar. In an age where the high priesthood was to a certain extent up for barter, that this should have political ramifications is not surprising. Jesus himself displays some of these attitudes in the gospel portrayal of the temple cleansing affair, where zealot language is explicitly attributed to him. Similar zeal for the temple is attributed to his brother James in the portraits of his piety and righteousness in early church literature. Not only does James 2:10 stress his zeal for the law, but all accounts dwell on how the flesh on his knees resembled camel's hide from all the importuning of God he did in the context of what appears to have been a Yom Kippur atonement. Similar zeal